Latta. I am the author of C.S. Lewis and the Art of Writing, right there, and a few other books. And I'm really happy to be with you here at the Imagination Redeemed. Sorry I couldn't be in person, and this has been great too. I want to talk about the hero's journey, and I want to talk about it from a bit of a different perspective. We're really fond of, I know I am, fond of talking about the hero's place in the journey. But I want to maybe frame it this way. I want to talk about the journey's place in the hero. Now, I love this paradigm of the hero and the hero's journey and the hero's place in the journey. I've gotten a ton of mileage out of it. I have, I would say most often, thought of myself as this protagonist. You know, I'm the pilgrim on the progress. And this is my movie, right? Or my quest, my journey. And this is not, unique to me. I'm sure you've done the same. Literature has, cast life in this, kind of metaphor of or idea of journey, going all the way back to Gilgamesh. We think about lines like, Dante, the start of the Divine Comedy, says midway through our life journey. And that line, I have to say, is a little more salient to me than it's been before. I turned 40 as I record this, so that line hits me differently. We think about Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and just the way he overlays the development of life itself. I mean, he has this unique way of kind of framing all of existence in the movement of journey. You have all these great lines in that text that speak to the journey, but really speak to life. We all remember this line. Bilbo says, "It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to." We think about decisions we make as through the lens of journey, as being a part of journey. One of the most quoted poems in American poetic history is Robert Frost, "Two roads diverge in yellow wood." And that last stanza, "I'll be telling this with a sigh, ages and ages hence. I took the road less traveled by, and that's made all the difference." This notion of kind of travel and voyage and decisions being put on that path, and I love it. I mean, that's the way I've thought about my life too. And it's called the hero's journey, or maybe you've known it as the monomyth. It's called the hero's journey philosophically and literarily as a kind of template and a universal one at that, because it's so ubiquitous. We can all sort of find ourselves in it. So if you're not familiar, and you probably are, but the hero's journey, you could sort of think of as a circle, and at the top of the circle is the hero. And he starts off in the known. This is like the commonplace. It's Frodo in the Shire. It's Simba before the death of Mufasa. It's Luke on Tatooine, and it's just humble origins in which everything is familiar. And something it's Harry before he's told you're a wizard, Harry. It's something we can relate to, right? And the hero is thrown from the known to the unknown, and on that quest into perilous realms, he meets teachers and guardians. He or she meets teachers and guardians and helpers, and the descent continues at the bottom of that circle until we get to the abyss. And the hero, at that lowest point of the journey, darkest point of the journey, faces himself, confronts his identity, his purpose or lack of. And if the abyss doesn't swallow him or her up, he has a chance to be transfigured, transformed, renewed purpose, hidden strengths discovered. And he comes out of the abyss, or she comes out of the abyss and comes back up the other side and returns to the known triumphant, right? I love that. I romanticize it. But I have to confess, I think some of my motivation for approaching life that way and projecting myself onto life that way is suspect. And it's taken approaching midway through my life's journey to realize that. And I could go into, what all those things are. I think probably, some of them are shame, the sense of not being enough and having to kind of romanticize myself or kind of imbue my story with a grandiose, sense of purpose and who I am, or probably overvaluing, doing over being, all the other reasons. But I found that that paradigm works until it doesn't work. And there's a lot of reasons why it doesn't work. I think once you find that it doesn't work, something else has to complement or come into play. There's a great book, maybe to illustrate this, there's a great book by a Jungian psychologist or a depth psychologist named James Hollis. He's got a book called The Middle Passage. Phenomenal book. In The Middle Passage, he says, essentially, there are two adulthoods. There's the first adulthood and the second adulthood, and we're all born into our own first adulthood. What characterizes the first adulthood is you carrying everything your mom said needs to be true for you, or your church, or your subculture, or your particular faith sect, or your teachers, or your small town, or your nation. It's just you carrying all these ideas that are, passed off as truth and right and good and noble, and maybe they are. And you go through this first adulthood burdened by these things. You're just kind of carrying these things. You don't quite know if you believe them or if they're true, but it's what you've been told and it's what you feel is right, and on you go. Until something happens, and it all comes crashing down. A divorce, a death, a near-death experience, death of a dream even, just disappointment, failure of some sort, terminal illness, something happens. And you have to reevaluate all these ideas that you've been freighted with. He says there's a narrow corridor then, a small passage, the middle passage, in which you can enter into the second adulthood. And what defines the second adulthood is more attention to the plot itself, to the journey itself, rather than your place in it. So you become, you cease to be the sun around which everything orbits, and you begin to realize that you have to orbit around something greater than yourself. So, it's a shift from you living life on your terms to you having to live it on its terms. To go back to our hero's journey, it would be the hero thinking less about himself on the journey and more on the fact that there's a journey that was there before him, to begin with, and will be there after him and exist, and its existence is, important and large enough, grand enough for him to think of himself in the light of, right? So let me give you a couple of texts. And what I'm really talking about is the inextricability of the journey from the hero, not just the hero from the journey. There's a couple of texts that I think illustrate this really well, just as examples, and we'll keep pushing into this. One of my favorite short stories to teach ever. I've taught this short story 100 times over the last 15 years. Is Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants. Absolutely brilliant. James Joyce called it the perfect short story. And Hemingway, C.S. Lewis and Hemingway got me into literary studies. I know that's an odd pairing. Hills Like White Elephants, 4 pages long. It is about, some spoiler alerts here. Go read it. It's about an American man, an expatriate, who goes over to Spain, meets a European woman, and begins to just live a prodigal life, right? As expatriates were apt to do. And at some point, he gets her pregnant. Now, Hemingway writes this thing so brilliantly that you don't know what they're talking about. It's never mentioned. It's only alluded to. I've taught this to probably 1,000 students. I would say 0.1% figure out that the thing they're talking about is abortion, right? So here's this American man who wants this European woman to have an abortion because he wants to keep partying. He wants to keep living how he's lived. And she doesn't want it. She wants to keep this baby. Now, Hemingway the American has no name. You just know he's an American. And the girl is nicknamed by her. Her name is Jig. So you don't know her real name. Because it's not the characters that matter as much as the story, the plot. All right. So he sets this thing at a train station in Spain. And they're sitting at a table and they're drinking, as characters in Hemingway are apt to do. And they're looking out on one side of the train tracks. And on this side, the grass is dead and brown. The hills are ashen and white, but they look like the backs of elephants, white elephants. There's no life. There's no vegetation. It's just dead. As he's talking to her and trying to manipulate her into making this decision, she's looking out on the side of death. Okay. She begins to gain more of herself. And she as she does and stands up for herself, she walks over to the other side of the train tracks. And on that side, she looks out and she finds green grass, fields of grain, rain clouds, a river, life. And Hemingway lays out before you life and death without ever mentioning what exactly is at stake here. Not only that, he sets the plot at a train station. I tell my students all the time, like, this is not that's significant. They're not making a U-turn, not literally, not proverbially. It's as if Hemingway's saying, once you get on this train, once your ticket is punched, you're not coming back. I mean, this is a choice with gravity, with weight. Another story. Tolstoy, another short story, Three Hermits. So Three Hermits is this delightful little story about a bishop who is educated and erudite. He knows his theology. And he hears about these three hermits that live on this island. And these hermits are supposedly holy men, right? And the bishop gets a little suspicious and like, I want to meet these guys. And he goes over and visits them and finds them to be ignorant. They're just ignorant. They have childish prayers. They don't know a thing about Scripture. They barely can, articulate their notions of God. And the bishop's like, okay, guys, just stand back here. And he begins to educate them. And, teaches them catechism and Scripture and all that stuff, the Lord's Prayer. And after a time of just sort of indoctrinating them, he leaves. And the story ends with him, sailing away on this boat and seeing something on the horizon. And he thinks, is that another boat? It turns out it's the three hermits. They're not walking on water. Okay, so they got Peter beat here. They're not walking on water. They're gliding on water. And they glide up to his boat and they say, Bishop, as soon as you left, we forgot everything you taught us. We tried to repeat it over and over and over. And as soon as we stopped repeating it, we forgot. Can you teach us again? And the bishop is just astonished. And he says, there's nothing I can teach you, holy men. God will hear your prayers. Go in peace. Why are those stories good examples of what I'm talking about? Because you can't extract the plot itself, the arc, the action, the setting from the characterization or the character's place in the story. It's the narrative that dominates. It's the journey that becomes so large and imposing in your imagination as you read. That, I think, is what I'm talking about when I would suggest is the other piece, the other side of this, paradigm of the hero's journey. It's not just the hero and the journey; it's the journey in the hero. It's not that I'm a protagonist in my own film. It's that there's a film at all. It's that it has a director. There are other characters. That there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. That there's a plot afoot that gives me an ultimate sense of meaning and purpose. Now that sounds like maybe a basic thing to say, but I found it not basic at all, and how it's often lived. I think most of us get sort of wrapped up in and stuck on this idea of our place in the story, and in doing so, we kind of miss the story. What would it look like to think more about the journey and the hero rather than the hero and the journey? There's a couple of biblical examples of this that I think are helpful. One is straight out of Genesis. It's the beginning of the great story. So in Genesis 1 and 2, we have obviously the creation of everything, and firmament is created, and the seas and everything, and animals, and then all of a sudden we have man. And we're told in that text that God says, Adam and Eve, see, I have given you everything, right? I think to talk about how we can move from, just sort of think about life as the hero and the journey, and to get more toward the journey and the hero, we have to look at this text, or at least extract this idea of givenness. It's interesting. We read the scripture and we sort of like chart the characters, right? And rightfully, we find ourselves in Adam, we find ourselves in Cain or Eve, and in David, right? But the way the scriptures start is the plot has already commenced. The journey has begun before we find the characters, and once the characters are introduced or created in it, their responsibility is to receive what already is, and what already is the quest. I think the hinge on which turns this hero journey hero paradigm is givenness, the givenness of things. See, givenness in theology and philosophy, the ability to receive, is a relational function, and it allows us to receive relational goods. And there's nothing more relational and more ontological, more closely in tune with who we are, than the ability to receive. So the problem with, this is certainly, as I've entered my middle passage, this is certainly something I discovered in myself. The problem with constantly thinking about the hero and the journey is it's all projection. It's all what I can assert or what I can do, and how I can sort of impose myself, insert myself in this story, in this quest. And the muscle that doesn't get worked out is the receptive muscle. It's the fact that this great plot has already commenced. Whatever act I came in on, the play goes on. It is well underway, and my task is to receive it. See, I have given you. Is my part important? Yeah, I think so. I mean, the great author saw fit to write me into the story. But more important even is the fact that there's a story to receive it all. There's another text also in Acts. Paul is talking to the Athenians in Acts 17, and he's trying to help them understand kind of who they are in terms of their need for the divine, for God. And he says something that's really brilliant. He says, from one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. Like, he set the stage. He created the plot. The journey was already in motion, right? God did this so they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find them, though he's not far from any of us. Much like that text in Genesis 1 and 2, see, I've given you. Here we find, Paul showing us something of ourselves and about ourselves through this larger narrative that is God's providentially placing us where we're going to be born, when we're going to be born, because God saw fit for us to reach for him at this particular, for me, it's just north of Memphis, Tennessee, and, the journey started for me in 1980, but the larger plot included me being born in this little paragraph of the story, this little kind of partition in the road of the journey, so that I might know the one who created the whole thing. I might know the journey maker himself. So I think one way we kind of move from hero on the journey and journey to journey and the hero is realize that our highest call, and I want to say a word to my fellow artists here in a second, but our highest call just as people isn't always to insert ourselves or to assert ourselves or to project or carry on. Sometimes it's just to receive what's been given to us, and what's been given to us is life itself. Both Frederick Buechner and Henry Nouwen talk about this. They talk about, if you want to understand sort of God's will, we often make the mistake of kind of looking around our life. We sort of like rummage through our life and try to find these Easter eggs of God's divine will. And both say the same thing. Frederick Buechner in The Sacred Journey and Henry Nouwen in a book called Discernment. They say, stop looking around your life, look at your life. Like, look in your life. His will is your life. You want to know what God's will is? It's what's happening to you now. If you want to know who you are as a character in the story, look at the story. The plot reveals it. So I think to start to go in that direction, we have to exercise something of this givenness. We have to begin to adopt that mentality. And I think, this is James Hollis's point, and certainly something I've experienced too. I think God will, he takes us to that middle passage. He brings us there. Now, let me say a word about, I think all this matters for all of us. But I think artists particularly have, we have a maybe an intuitive connection to what I'm saying here. If you think about art itself, when I first started writing, I was absolutely obsessed with what I published. I mean, all I cared about was a book, an article. I just wanted my name. I wanted bylines, right? And the sense of defeat I would have when something got rejected or, didn't get picked up, didn't get reviewed well, whatever it was. I was such a narcissist, really. And everything rode on my identity as author. And then the more I wrote, the more I read, the more I lived, the more I was rejected, the more I was accepted. I realized, along with many, many artists before me, and this is a phenomenal kind of parallel to what I'm talking about in terms of hero, journey, hero, is my stuff just doesn't matter. I mean, it does, but it doesn't. What matters is that there's art to begin with, and art to end with, and art in the middle. One of my favorite books, and you probably know it well, is Madeleine L'Engle's Walking on Water. She's got this line, perfectly captures this. She says, if the work comes to the artist, think about life, but for the artist, the inspiration of the work, and says, here I am, serve me, then the job of the artist, great or small, is to serve. The amount of the artist's talent is not what it is about. John Race said to an interviewer in the Paris Review, listen to me. All of writing is a huge lake. There are great rivers that feed that lake, like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and there are mere trickles, like John Race. All that matters is feeding the lake. I don't matter. The lake matters. You must keep feeding the lake. Who I am in this great schema, it matters. Of course it matters. But not more than the schema itself. For the artist, for the writer, for the musician, you matter. Your art matters. Your craft, it matters. But not more than craftsmanship itself. Not more than the Great Lake. Lewis, I quote this letter all the time. Lewis is talking to his best friend, Arthur Greeves, who, and this is before Lewis became a Christian, Arthur Greeves had a novel rejected, and he's totally despondent. And Lewis, who's already nearing kind of a spiritual awakening, he gives this beautiful analogy. He says, look, beauty descends from us, or descends to us from God, or comes from God. And it's our job to simply receive it and to give it back. And all that matters is the circle. He says, through that process, a beautiful circle is made. That's what matters most. That you serve the circle, that you feed the lake. And I think when we're talking about life and understanding ourselves in it and purpose, It's less about, you know, who I am individually, what I want, my aspirations and my desires, and just kind of the subtle self-centeredness that I know I've lived with, and I found many of my fellow artists have, and you know, we humans we just do. It's less about that, and it's more about the fact that there is something to be given to give ourselves to, something to receive, to be given. Yeah, it's a beautiful parallel. So artist, I think we have kind of an inner track here, inner lane to this notion. But back to the topic at large. What does it look like then, or what does it mean? What are some implications to think about, you know, the journey and the hero, and less about the hero and the journey? I couldn't stop kind of mulling these things over, and the best I could come up with, I just sort of journal on these things, and they've really become, I mean, to be honest, they've become sort of charges to me that I hope to live into in the future, because this paradigm shift has become pretty significant for me. So implications for this, of thinking more about the journey, right, and less about myself in it. One is, if you think about givenness again, like what virtue would givenness produce? I think we would say it's acceptance. If you are, you know, psychologically, philosophically, in terms of wisdom literature, I mean, like there's so many different sources that converge on this idea of acceptance. Think about the serenity prayer, right? Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage things I can, wisdom know the difference. I think the virtue that givenness births is acceptance. One of the most healthy spiritual and emotional and mental virtues, exercises that I can give myself to, is simply accepting what comes from the master's table. You know, on this quest, are there dragons to slay and castles to storm? And yeah, there are. And sometimes the dragon's going to eat me, and sometimes I'm not gonna siege that castle. In all of it, just to accept that what's being given to me is good for me. That everything that happens to me, this journey, right, is happening for me. So I think givenness produces acceptance. I also think I can just rest in this paradigm shift. I have spent so many days and months, years, trying too hard to do this thing called life. I have turned, oftentimes, too often, I've turned this gift into just a laborious duty. And I think so much of that comes from me projecting myself so much onto life, trying to occupy the role of hero, instead of letting life maybe cast the part I'm supposed to play, casting it for me. I think once I meditate more on the journey, right? Think about the way the journey is inhabiting me rather than me inhabiting it. Think about God's placing me exactly where He did, that I might reach and find Him, because He's not far from me. Think about all He's given me, not around my life, but through and in my life. I could just rest. I mean, so many times in Scripture, so many times in literature, we see the hero finally come to the end of himself, and some kind of, miraculous intervention, some sort of divine aid. It's the Eagles, if you're a Tolkien fan. Intercede. And I think that is the moment in literary text in which we see this turn, that the hero just can't carry all this on him, on his own shoulders. It's got to be something larger than himself has got to occupy the text, sort of take the stage. So I think it produces rest. And I'll end with this. Hope. I don't have a whole lot of, again, sort of seeing yourself as the hero and fixating on your place in the journey. It works until it doesn't work. And I can't get a lot of hope in my ability. I mean, I can do a lot. I'm a high capacity person. At the same time, I can't do much at all. My hope lies in the one who has set this journey before me, not just my ability to travel it. That's freeing. That's beautiful. So to find my place on this quest and this journey, I think it's probably more about the journey itself as it existed before me, as it will exist after me. And then receiving this journey with gratitude. I want to end with this quote. It's one of my all-time favorites. You probably know it. I probably could have just read this and that been it. But it's from the great father of American poetry, Whitman. O me, O life, of the questions of these recurring, of the endless trains of the faithless, of cities filled with the foolish, of myself forever reproaching myself, for who more foolish than I, and who more faithless? Of eyes that vainly crave the light, of the objects mean, of the struggle ever renewed, of the poor results of all, of the plotting and sordid crowds I see around me, of the empty and useless years of the rest with the rest me intertwined. The question, O me, so sad recurring, what good amid these, O me, O life? Answer, that you are here, that life exists and identity, that the powerful play goes on and you may contribute a verse. That the powerful play goes on and you may contribute a verse.